Hey guys, we are back, and this is the fourth installment of the moral nature of God. God is a vegan, and we're showing that side of Him. Today's discussion is going to be the flesh pots continued. And if I don't know if you've noticed this theme yet, but in 3 different consecutive chapters of the book, chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7, there are 3 titles, one in each chapter, that are titled the flesh pots. Flesh pots in 5, the flesh pots continued in 6, and then the flesh pots concluded in chapter 7. So there are 3 different flesh pot discussions, depending on where you're at in the book. So that's where we're at today. The flesh pots continued. So this is the second flesh pot discussion. And one of the things, we're going to go back and visit the passages that talk about how sacrifice was centralized, and it was they were given boundaries on where they could do it. And we're also going to talk about how the food sacrifice revolved around food. A lot of people try to separate those 2 concepts and say that people were allowed to kill animals whenever they wanted if it was to eat. That's not true. Like we discussed in the last flesh pot video, it was like just the fact that they were always grumbling about not having flesh to eat, is that in itself, that being one of the highlights of their journey through the wilderness, is enough to demonstrate that they were not allowed to just consume flesh whenever. They weren't allowed to kill animals to eat whenever they wanted. That's what God was trying to wean them off of through this system. So, and then towards the end of the video, we're going to talk about whether it is lawful to consume flesh today, even under Levitical and Deuteronomic law. And then we're going to talk about what is clean, what is kosher, what's the difference, and how people today just don't even care. If something's labeled beef on a package that they buy in a store, that's all that they need. It's all that they care about. They don't care about how it made its way into that package. To them, if it says beef, they're eating clean according to their Torah convictions, and that's all that that's enough. So that's basically it. That's the few things that we have today. It might turn into a long video just because this section is so long. But the first thing to realize is that shifting the Torah paradigm, this book, it's not just a transformation about our beliefs today. Because a lot of the things we talk about shows that the Israelites experienced their own paradigm shift once they were delivered from Egypt. And I talked about this in the last few videos, how they were so pagan that they did not know a thing about the true God, the Creator, the one who had brought them out of Egypt. And that is why they were, that is why some of the ideas that they had about pagan gods, they attributed to the true God. That's why they were sacrificing to him. They were treating him the same way that they knew how to treat gods, because they were in Egypt for so long that is what they knew of religion. So all of these things that you see that made their way into the Bible, it was all pagan. It was all how the ancients worshipped their gods. It just so happened that we're dealing with a people who didn't know what God really wanted, so they were doing the same things to him, and that's where God had to set boundaries. And when they came out of Egypt, it was culture shock. They understood the difference between blood ritual and they didn't understand. They did not understand the difference between blood ritual and sacrifice. It was just kill the animals, do the blood sacrifice, and eat the food, right? Eat the flesh of the animals. But When God brought them out, he showed them the difference. They were doing blood rituals, and it would become sacrifice through the sacrificial system. And that's one of the major contrasts between the foreign nations that they came out of and where God was trying to bring the Israelites. It's how the Father established separation between the heathen and his people. And if you want to know what I mean, is like it wasn't a sacrifice because they were just killing and eating. Now, if they could appreciate the animal and its life, it would become a sacrifice and that's just the definition of sacrifice. And when you're just doing it and it's not a sacrifice, it doesn't mean anything. You're just fulfilling your flesh. But when the Father introduced this sacrificial system, he helped them to realize that it was more about the sacrifice than the ritual and then the eating of flesh. He wanted to get their mind on that. And there's a difference. Blood ritual focuses on the ceremony. It involves the handling of blood, like we looked at in a few places. But sacrifice, it's just that. It is a sacrifice. It's something you give up, okay? So when the Father introduced this system, he designed a method of preservation as well as a rehab center. That's what this was. The Israelites were going through rehab. It was an opportunity for them to recover from the cultural influence of the nations and learn to value their livestock. And that's what it's all about. And the more you value something, the harder it is to give it up. He wanted them to see what they were face to face with, an animal who doesn't want to die. Okay. And when you're around animals and you get to know them, you can see that they do have personalities. Okay. They don't want to die. God designed animals with the same fear-based instincts that we have when we're in danger. And this is just one of those areas where I like to challenge people to think about why would a God create something with those instincts only to kill them? Something that can suffer, something that is afraid. Why would he create it with those attributes and then expect us or say that he designed those for us to kill when they would experience that? Would he intentionally design something to suffer? That's what's messed up, and that's what people are afraid to think about. So, but getting back to the rehab center thing, if the Israelites could just learn to appreciate animals as God's creation and not a common dinner item, then that would be a start. I mean, that would get them in the right direction. And we do have people, there's record in the Bible of people throughout time who abstained completely from sacrifice and consuming flesh, all while observing Torah from a vegetarian position. And I think the most common is Daniel, the prophet Daniel. And I know a lot of people argue that, and we won't get into that now, but I think it's very clear that he wasn't just vegetarian for a few weeks. It was his lifestyle, and that he challenged them for a few weeks' time, because that's all he needed to prove himself and to say that, hey, look, his diet's better. But the purpose for the sacrificial system, it was twofold. People don't want to admit this, but people in Torah, they don't want to admit this. It would teach Israel to appreciate God's creation, okay, like we just talked about, and it would monitor their meat consumption. It would show the people what a sacrifice really was. If they can appreciate God's creation, then it would turn it into a sacrifice. They felt like they were losing something or giving something up to satisfy their lust. And that's what he wanted them to do. Look. But it's just like people today. It's where people are today. If you have not noticed, people don't think twice about going through the drive-thru, getting their cheeseburger. They don't see the life of the animal. And people just don't value animals today. Dogs, your cat, pets. But when it comes to the food items or the animals that we consider food, people don't value those animals. They think it's perfectly normal to kill those animals because it's food. We've just gotten away from God's design so much. We've let the culture affect us that we can't get our mind to where we can't understand what God was trying to do, because we're in the same place as the Israelites who couldn't value animals because they considered them food items. It wasn't a sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice today. They're expendable. Animals today in our culture and society are just expendable food items. Okay. And that's why people can't see this. People are unwilling to see this because they cannot value an animal. Okay. But since the Israelites, they constantly demanded animal flesh, the system would appease to their wants on certain occasions. It wouldn't allow them to do it all the time. And it would limit how much and how often. Okay. And so where we were at in the last flesh pot discussion, there's a lot of people who insist that the sacrificial system had nothing to do with common meat consumption, which is not true. I can't say that enough. And for all intents and purposes, the sacrificial system revolved around food consumption, okay? It allowed minimal opportunity for the Israelites to satisfy their craving while considering the animal whose life they were forfeiting. When they were face to face, God was teaching them to be face to face with these animals, to look at them and to value them so that it would be a sacrifice, okay? And I really like what this author who wrote the Bible, Richard Elliott Friedman, I really like what he says. I'll put it on the screen and we can read this together. If I can size it up exactly the right way. Here we go. Let's take a look at this. He says the function of sacrifice is one of the most misunderstood matters in the Bible. In the biblical world, the most common type of sacrifice was for meals. Well, this guy recognizes that. That's good. The apparent rationale was that if humans wanted to eat meat, they had to recognize that they were taking a life. It's good. That's what God was trying to do, help them to value the animal. They could not regard this as an ordinary act of daily secular life. It was a sacred act to be performed as in a prescribed manner by an appointed person, a priest, at an altar. You see, like when we were talking about how it had to be, it couldn't just be anytime, anywhere, or any place. That's what he's talking about here. A portion of the sacrifice, a tithe, was given to the priests. And as we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, when we talk about the temple incident, that's one of the reasons that it caused so much controversy, is because he was messing with their business. The centralization of religion meant that if you wanted to eat lamb, you could not sacrifice your sheep at home or at a local sanctuary. You had to bring the sheep to the priest at the temple altar in Jerusalem. This also would mean a sizable gathering of Levite priests at Jerusalem, which was not the only sanctioned location where they could conduct their sacrifices and receive their tithes. Okay, so that's really good. Goes right along with what we're talking about. And his book is really good. It's not about sacrifice. It is more about who wrote the Bible. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 9. But what he's talking about, it reveals the nature of sacrifice. It wasn't just about forfeiting their property or net worth. It was about actually recognizing that their actions forfeited the lives of God's creation. And it explains why the Father established so many stipulations when he instituted that system. So in the wilderness, He wanted to deliver the Israelites, but he wanted to deliver them from their blood obsession. And he wanted to renew their minds with the true essence of sacrifice. Okay. So the Creator, Yahweh, he was trying to eliminate the careless massacre. He reduced the excessive amounts of bloodshed by marking boundaries. And so only within that prescribed area, same thing that Friedman was talking about, and through the designated officials, they were allowed to slaughter from time to time. And in Leviticus 17, verse 3 through 5, we've looked at this passage. I won't bring it up again, but that's the reference if you want to look at it. It's the one where it says, if any native Israelite sacrifices a bull or a lamb or a goat anywhere inside or outside the camp, instead of bringing it to the entrance of the tabernacle, if you don't bring this to the designated place to present it as an offering to the Lord, that person will be as guilty as a murderer. Such a person has shed blood and will be cut off from the community. The purpose of this rule is to stop the Israelites from sacrificing animals in the open fields, which is what they were doing to other gods and for their own carnal pleasure of eating flesh outside of the system. It will ensure that they bring their sacrifices to the priest at the entrance of the tabernacle so he can present them to the Lord as peace offerings. And there they got a distorted idea of what our God wants. God just wanted them to do it in front of him. He's saying, don't do it to the other gods. If you're going to do it, here's the area to do it. And so still they're thinking that he wants this kind of worship. He wants them to do this to him as a form of worship, which is not the case. He wants them to stop doing it altogether. But so he instituted this command that none should ever slaughter an animal outside the allocated space or without a priest. Okay, this is what is referred to as centralized worship. Outside of the Levitical system, all animal sacrifices were in violation of the law. And I've asked a lot of people about this, if they would agree that eating animal meat or the flesh of dead animals is only permitted under certain stipulations or in correspondence with the law. And this is where a lot of people say, yeah, it's different when you kill for the sole purpose of food. Basically, they contend that the Israelites were allowed to kill and eat animals at their own discretion from their own flocks and herds. And like my argument is that if this were true, then it would defeat the purpose of the system altogether. That was the point of the sacrificial system, was to eliminate it, reduce the amount, monitor everything they were doing, and only allow them to do it within that area by the priest. It was just a heavily monitored system. So that's the point of it. And people think, oh no, they were allowed to, it had nothing to do with killing and eating. Well, it had everything to do with it. That was the point of it. And Scripture doesn't make that distinction for the people who think that it is different. No, I see the opposite when I read Scripture. As I understand it, the primary purpose of the sacrificial system was to satisfy their lust for animal flesh. It's just as simple as understanding the context, which is what people refuse to do. They think this was a holy, righteous people who had always known everything their Creator wanted, and he just brought them out. They were just in bondage, and God just needed to bring them out. Well, no, we're dealing with people who knew nothing about God. They knew everything about the gods of Egypt. They were worshiping the gods. They were more pagan than Christians today. I mean, Christians today, at least, focus on God, the Creator, and just incorporate some pagan ways. Now, when we're dealing with the Israelites, they weren't even focused on the Creator. They were focused on the gods. I mean, these were heathens. God had to teach them from scratch. Like, he had to start at square one with these guys. So anyway, yeah, it was a system that allowed them to consume meat on certain occasions and within a designated area. It was a ration system. So there were consequences for people who violated the stipulations. Okay, like it said, they will be considered guilty as murderers. So whoever slaughtered an animal outside the camp, they would be cut off from the people. And it's like this idea seems so foreign to people in Hebrew roots. It's like they don't get it or want to understand that that's really what was going on. But even though people don't even get it today, there are different generations throughout time in Judaism who understand this. It's in the Talmud. So, and here's a few references that I'm going to pull up. And I have these written in the footnotes where you can find these. When the temple is standing, rejoicing is only through the eating of sacrificial meat, as it is stated, and you shall sacrifice peace offerings and eat there. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God. And now that the temple is not standing, and one cannot eat sacrificial meat, he can fulfill the mitzvah of rejoicing on a festival only by drinking wine, as it is stated, and wine that gladdens the heart of man. And that was in Psalm 45. But this text is taken from one of the books of the Talmud. And then here's another reference. It says, when the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews. Sorry, that word tripped me up. Whose practice was not to eat meat or drink wine. And Rabbi Yehoshua joined them to discuss their practice. He said to them, my children, for what reason do you not eat meat and do you not drink wine? And they said to him, should we eat meat from which offerings and sacrifice are sacrificed on the altar now that the altar ceases to exist? You see that? It's like people understood, and I'm not sure when these books exactly were written, the Babylonian Talmud, post-destruction of the temple, obviously, but it's like people understood this, that without the temple, without this centralized place of sacrifice, they weren't supposed to be eating meat. That's why it's written that, like, historically documented that the people are stopping, they're not going to eat meat anymore because the temple was destroyed. There's nowhere to sacrifice lawfully. You can't do it. And, you know, I don't know how many of you are versed in this Talmudic library. I'm not, but I think those references are very telling. And the point is that earlier generations understood that sacrifice was expected to be done within an assigned area, okay? But I'm going to be fair here because I'm fair all throughout this book. There is further clarification in the story of their journey. And I think this has a lot to do with who wrote the Bible, because it does conflict with what we just learned. And I think the different parties, there were the priestly parties, the Deuteronomic parties, the different parties who wrote the books of Moses are saying different things. They really are. That's just the way it is. It contradicts what we just read. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 20 through 25, it says, when the Lord thy God shall enlarge thy border, when you make it to the promised land, when you reach your destination, as he has promised, and you will say that you want to eat flesh because thy soul longeth to eat flesh. I think this is big because it's still calling eating flesh soul lust. It's referring to what their souls wanted to do, that I will eat flesh because thy soul longeth to eat flesh. It's like something you were wanting and not something that God intended for you. So when you get to the border and you're saying, I want to eat flesh, you may eat flesh, whatever your soul lusteth after. Let's get that up here. Whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. When you get to the border and you're so adamant about eating flesh, you may eat flesh, whatsoever your soul lusts after. If the place that the Lord thy God has chosen to put his name there is too far from you, then you can kill of your herd and your flock, which the Lord has given thee. I have commanded thee, and thou shalt eat in thy gates whatsoever thy soul lusts after. Again, talking about it's according to their lust. People don't want to admit this. They totally overlook it. They just focus on, oh, see, look, now they're allowed to eat flesh wherever they want. See, so we are lawfully allowed to kill and consume animals now. That's all they're worried about. Don't care that it's soul lust. That their habits, what they want to do, is unnatural. It is not how they were created. And they focus on these other parts. This is called selective emphasis. It's where you emphasize a portion of text that suits your lust, and that's the only part of the text you go by. And you totally blow over the other parts of the text. Okay? And that's in Deuteronomy 20. And, it appears to promote this unrestricted allowance for killing and eating animals. But people, they miss the bigger picture. It's, like I said, it's their lust. But from what I understand of this text, God's saying, if your lust for animal flesh is that strong, and if the stipulations are too burdensome, then fine. Eat flesh according to your lust. Once they reach their future destination. It didn't mean that it was ever God's will to kill or consume animals. Like I said, the key is to understand that it was something that they wanted. It was a sinful desire. Okay, I can't say it any other way. I can call it lust here and there. But it was a sinful desire because it's not natural. People hate when you call eating animals a sin. But if something goes against the order of design, that's a sin. It's a strong word, but it's just the way it is. It's not natural. If you're doing something that you were not intended to do, then it's a sin. Okay? If you know the good that you ought to do and you don't do it, you sin. And I know people like to jump to 1 John or whichever book it says, transgression of the law is sin. So people love that. So then people, they don't even know the law. They don't even know what the purpose of the law is, but they'll quote that and then jump back to the first century Pharisaic mindset where it made the law into a checklist. And they think, oh, we got to do all these things. And if you don't, you're a sinner. But they're missing the bigger picture that they're not living according to design. The higher morale. I don't have a problem saying that. Okay, but it does explain why certain sects of Judaism continued to abide by the initial stipulations and refrain from animal slaughter outside the designated area. It's because there's more evidence that animal slaughter was controlled by the Levitical system within that designated area. Even after those restrictions were lifted, the text that we just read, right? In chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, well, in chapter 15 of Deuteronomy, it says, all the firstling males that come of thy herd and of thy flock thou shalt sanctify to the Lord. Thou shalt do no work with the firstlings of thy bulls, nor shear the firstling of thy sheep. Thou shalt eat it before the Lord thy God year by year in the place which the Lord shall choose, thou and thy household. And that's in chapter 15, verses 19 and 20. So even after he's telling them, your restrictions are lifted, and that's all people want to hear is, oh, yay, we get to do it anytime, anywhere. Yay, party, barbecue, cookout. But even after that text, the following text says, still, you need to eat it where I choose. He's saying these stipulations are still here. But if you're going to do it, like you said before, if you're going to do it, you're going to do it anyway, according to your lust. It wasn't him approving of them just doing it anywhere. He was saying you're going to do it anytime, anywhere, anyway, because you lust after it. But then he gives this command that, look, you still need to do it year by year in the place which the Lord shall choose, you and your household. So, yeah, some passages seem to allow the reckless slaughtering of animals, but the fact is that there's been a lot of controversy centered around this issue, and Torah people aren't willing to admit it. They don't want to admit that, hey, this is an area of controversy that we really need to sort out. They ignore it. They ignore these clear instructions against it, and they just focus on when your borders are open, eat to your soul's content. But despite any of these allowances that are seen throughout the text, there are still law-abiding believers, people who observe the law of Moses throughout time, people who have been Torah observant, and they have rejected the eating of animal flesh. And I think the Essenes, which we are going to talk about a lot more in the following chapters. Matter of fact, in probably the rest of the videos from here on out, we're going to at least bring them up once or twice in each video. There's going to be a video that revolves around the Essenes. So the Essenes, the Ebionites, or here's one. Have you heard the term Nazarene? Okay. That's the most recognized term that a lot of people in Torah, they identify by that label, and without knowing that the Nazarene or the Ebionites is how they were also known. They were vegetarians. They were followers of Yeshua who were anti-sacrifice vegetarian people today. They just see that term and they just want to identify by it, not knowing who they were. They just think it's a historical group that resembles their modern beliefs, which they don't. So it's ironic that I see this a lot of times. People are more focused on identifying with a historical group that they think matches their beliefs than they are. They're more worried about identifying as them without even knowing who they were. And the more you dig into the Ebionites, also known as the Nazarene, you'll know that they were vegetarian. They were anti-sacrifice. They did not observe this part of the law. They saw past it. They knew the purpose of it. They didn't need to. It didn't apply to them because they weren't flesh hungry. Okay? These groups, the Essenes, the Ebionites, or Nazarene, they abstained from flesh eating, and they were Torah observant. They observed the Torah. They kept the law according to what they understood, according to what Yeshua understood, what he was teaching. And Yeshua was an Essene. He was affiliated with that party. John the Baptist, and the man carrying the pitcher on his head, where he told, was it Peter? He told to go look for the man carrying a pitcher on his head in a community where the men were actually carrying pitchers. It was an Essene community. Otherwise, it would have been a woman carrying the pitcher. He was looking for a vegetarian-friendly community to celebrate the Last Supper or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? Where he did not eat or offer lamb. It wasn't a part of that story, by the way. But yeah, these groups, they're really good in your research about this subject. But despite the evidence, skeptics are going to continue suggesting the opposite, that the Israelites were always allowed to slaughter and consume meat outside of the sacrificial system. And it's argued that the stipulations apply only to animals with defects. Okay, this is where it gets a little sticky And I may not have the best answer every time for a lot of people who argue this, but so we'll look at all the texts. We'll try to use our logic as much as we can, because things have to make sense in light of the context of people who were eating meat out of lust. Okay, and a God who was trying to wean them off of that behavior. That is our context. Creation is our context. So, like I said, it's argued that these added stipulations apply only to animals with defects. It's true. It does say that in the text. If an animal had a defect, then according to the text below, and then I'm going to pull that up, it could be used for food outside of the designated area, but only because it was blemished. Okay. And that's the only condition through which meat or flesh was allowed to be consumed on the property of the individual and not the grounds, the sacrificial grounds. Deuteronomy 15, 21, and 22. It's basically just the very next verse of where I was talking about a minute ago that I read. It says, if there be a blemish therein, as if it be lame or blind, or have any ill blemish, thou shalt not sacrifice it unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt eat it within thy gates. And they didn't have to eat it. It's just saying, like, some people might have actually allowed this system to work the way it was meant to, and they would have refrained from it altogether. But he's saying, if you still, this is in the context that it's all based on their lust for eating these things. The unclean and clean person shall eat it alike, as the roebuck and as the hart, okay? Or the deer and the gazelle. It was a conditional allowance. It did not permit the Israelites to eat flesh whenever they wanted, okay? As much as people try to look for those loopholes or to say that the Israelites could consume flesh whenever they wanted, it's not true. And like we proved this in the last series, that the quail incident is more than enough to, it's more than enough evidence against the notion that people were allowed to consume anytime, anywhere, at their discretion. Otherwise, they would not have grumbled. It just doesn't make any sense for people to complain if they were allowed to do something. Does it? Does it make sense for people to complain about not being allowed to do something if they were allowed to do it? I mean, really, the entire system revolves around eating flesh, okay? But it's interesting that an allowance to eat meat was given in that passage for the blemished animals, but not without mentioning the unclean and clean person. And I think it's because touching a dead carcass, whether the animal is clean or unclean, it makes a person unclean either way. You know, you're not having the priests do this, right? If you're going to kill it on your own property, you're going to be unclean because you're touching a dead animal. It's just an example. That's why they mention the gazelle or the deer. It's because it's an example of what occurred outside of the Levitical system when people were breaking this whole law, when they weren't abiding by this. Just as a man might go and kill a deer to eat, it would make him unclean. Okay? And, you know, I know a lot of people think, no, the deer and the gazelle just demonstrates that what they were allowed to do outside of the Levitical system. No, not what they were allowed to do. It demonstrates what people were doing outside of the Levitical system, but not what they were allowed to do. They were doing that on their own. It neglects that touching a dead animal makes a person unclean either way, whether it's clean or unclean. And even in Leviticus 11, and people like to argue this because it says, if any beast which you may eat die, this is talking about clean beasts, he that touches the carcass thereof shall be unclean till the evening. And he that eateth of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean till the evening. He that bears the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean till the evening. Leviticus 11, 39 and 40, okay? So it appears by that it doesn't matter whether an animal falls under the category of clean or unclean, because in that passage in Leviticus 11, we're dealing with clean animals, okay? So if a person touches the flesh of a dead animal, even if it was clean, they would have been deemed unclean until the morning or the evening, because the animal was not prepared by the proper party, or it was not slaughtered within the designated area. And like I say in my book, is that let it be known that the passage that I just read pertains only to animals that die naturally, because this is where people will stop you in your tracks, and they'll point that out. No, is for animals that die on their own, not ones that you kill to eat. But okay, aside from that argument, consider just for a moment why it is unsanitary or unclean to handle raw meat or a dead animal, whether it qualifies as clean or unclean. Just think about this just for a second, please. I mean, if you're honest with the circumstances, you can't deny the disturbing nature of handling raw meat. One thing I am glad we don't have to do here in this house anymore. And it just my wife is so relieved too, because it just got her on edge. You know, someone with anxiety and just who's uptight about some things anyway. Things just make her a nervous wreck. And just having dead animal flesh in the house, unsanitary, the bacteria, everything, it used to get her on edge all the time. And after we were preparing our dinner, she was always bringing out the bottles of alcohol and sanitizing everything. Okay. Meat, dead meat, raw meat, flesh is slippery and slimy. I mean, you have to be careful to avoid touching anything else around you. Otherwise, you will have to sanitize whatever it touches. Unlike fruits and vegetables, you don't have to do that. A lot of people even use fruits to clean with. You ever seen the people using grapefruits and lemons to clean with? You can do that. You can't do that with a chub of chicken or a chub of beef or a chicken thigh. You can't do that. It will spread bacteria and cause sickness. It's because you are handling a dead body, mutilated flesh, not food. You're touching the remains of a corpse. Okay? That's why it's unclean. Flesh is not practical to handle because it promotes the spread of bacteria. Okay? So in essence, it's unclean, and it will contaminate anything it touches, regardless of how the animal perished. Okay? That's why it's unclean. Oh, and I think it's interesting that a lot of Bible translations, different Bibles, they offer disclaimers in the footnotes of Leviticus 11, stating that the identification of some of the animals listed in chapter 11 is uncertain, which leaves room for even more confusion. And so if our English Bibles are uncertain about animals that may be unclean, it could lead people to believe they're eating clean when they may not be. And if you know anything about chickens, which chickens are a breed of bird that didn't exist during the time that these laws were given, and I no doubt 100% believe that chickens are unclean. Just looking at them, their habits, I do not believe that these birds would have been deemed clean for anyone to eat had they existed around this time. It's a modern breed, and people just readily accept it as clean, even though they're just as questionable as any other unclean animal. And I saw a video. Someone sent me a video of a chicken eating a mouse that just happened to run across its path, which would automatically disqualify it as a clean bird, knowing that clean animals, from what I've concluded, are herbivores. So, and clean animals are those who abide by the original design, that natural order that God created. Okay? It might be another discussion for another time, but it's definitely worth mentioning. Today, Torah believers, they focus on what they should or shouldn't eat, whether it's clean or unclean, but they give no mind to how the meat makes its way to their plate. And they do their best to qualify the item without qualifying the process. And this is where Torah believers fail to uphold the standards within the law that they claim to uphold. So if we apply this principle to this law, this Mosaic law, if we apply the principles of the law to the modern food industry, then it's practically impossible for a person to purchase or consume animal meat that is compliant to kosher standards of the law, because whether it pertains to the treatment of the animal or a contamination issue are probably the two most common areas. Virtually all animals, people who eat animals, everyone who consumes meat today violates this aspect of Torah if you're purchasing from a grocery store. Okay, they've neglected the procedure. Okay, they attempt to qualify the item without qualifying the process. So, and what I'm arguing is that if you can't qualify the process for how your food makes its way to your plate, then you can't qualify the item itself. Okay, so if I stated it bluntly, it's not possible for someone to lawfully consume animal flesh if your meat is purchased at the store. It's prepackaged flesh. It includes steaks on the grill, fried chicken, that chub of hamburger for Taco Tuesday, and I'm going to say it, the lamb chops that you purchase every year for Passover. And to me, this is one of the greatest absurdities in the modern Hebrew roots movement. People who eat store-bought, non-kosher Passover lamb while suggesting that vegans cannot be in covenant with Yahweh because we don't eat the dead flesh of lamb. Oh gosh, it's so ironic. But consuming items from fast food chains or dine-in restaurants, if that just further violates the Levitical guidelines. A lot of people think it's clean by the Levitical standards, but these foods cannot be kosher by the same set of standards if they are purchased through commercial establishments. Okay, and here it is. I remember a woman about 6 months ago from a local Torah group who had a craving for a shredded beef chimichanga, and she decided to order takeout from a local Mexican restaurant. And after she got through about half of her plate, she suspected that something wasn't right. And so within a few moments, she looked everything over, evaluated the contents on her plate, and she realized, the restaurant made a mistake. They had given her shredded pork instead of beef. And I mean, to me, it's still a dead animal. It doesn't matter what it is, After you come to the revelation of, clean or unclean doesn't even matter when you're eating the dead flesh of a rotting carcass, But to her, it was traumatic. It was a traumatic experience. But what's sad is that I can't imagine that this little episode would have been enough for her to stop eating from these places. Because people, it'll just be something they complain about this time, and then they'll go back and then just make sure you make it beef, But it's like, for me personally, this is one of the reasons I do not dine in restaurant establishments or fast food chains. The risk just isn't worth it. The potential for cross-contamination, it's a lot higher than people realize. And now I think when I was eating clean meats, when I was, following the Torah mindset a couple years ago, someone challenged me. They said, well, the guy at Subway's, he's not changing his gloves just to make your clean sandwich. He's using that same glove that he just handled the ham with And now he's handling your turkey with that same glove. It's cross-contamination. And that's a good point. And I think there's just so many people today who don't think about that. But to me, it's just, I won't even go get a veggie sub from Subway for many reasons, not just the cross-contamination. I don't eat that crap, that bread that they have there. I eat living bread now. If you don't know anything about milling your own flour, look into it. But for some reason, people feel like they're keeping Torah as long as they stick with beef, chicken, and scaled fish. But I mean, it didn't take me long to figure it out, that the entire food industry has deceived most people who consider themselves Torah observant. But it's not that simple. It's not as simple as saying, all right, I'm eating a scaled fish. I'm eating chicken or beef. It's not that simple. Do you eat at these fast food establishments or sit-down restaurants? It doesn't matter. Do you buy your meat at the local grocery store? And if you do happen to utilize a kosher butcher, do you still handle the meat when you get home, when you prepare it? Are you touching a dead animal? It doesn't matter how hard you try. If you handle and consume animal flesh, because that's what the Levites were doing. The priests were the ones cooking the meal. Okay, so when it was prepared, they prepared it, and then they would consume it. But if you're the one preparing it, you're the one handling this rotting flesh, this slimy, bacteria-infested carcass. You're unclean until the eve because you're touching a dead animal. Not only in a legal sense, but in respect to hygiene, more so. Sanitation. Most people who purchase animal meats from commercial establishments, they fail to recognize the nature of sacrifice under the law. Okay? During the time of Moses, the people surrendered something of value and recognized that that's what they learned to do. They learned to recognize that the life of the animal was forfeited to fulfill their lust. That's what God was trying to get them to do. This is a sacrifice. This is a life. Okay? It's a form of creation that I created that does not want to die. It has the will to live. So what you're doing is sacrificing this life. Okay? But today, people don't even consider this biblical model to fulfill their lust. When they purchase a cheeseburger in the drive-thru, they don't care. They don't see the cow. So this entire concept of sacrifice, as it was understood to the Israelites, it's a foreign concept today. People don't even get they don't know what sacrifice is. Today, the life of the animal, that's the last concern for the average person because they're convinced for some reason that factory farmed beef qualifies as clean according to the law. But the Israelites, they were face to face with the animals that they sacrificed. And today, most Torah adherents, they have no regard for the life of the animals, mostly because they don't see the animals or know what occurs in these factory processing plants. So there's the disconnect right there. It reveals the law as it was observed by the Israelites versus the law today as it's disregarded by modern Hebrew roots advocates. Okay, and there it is, right there. That's the difference between the sacrificial system, eating meat back then, versus today. People think they're Torah observant and they're not. That's the bottom line. People are not Torah observant. They're not observing Torah. They're just saying they are. I mean, they got the t-shirt that says Yahuwah in 3 different languages. They got their tzitzits on. They got their pictures of their tents for Sukkot on Facebook. They don't give a crap about where their food's coming from. They don't know what a sacrifice is. They're not Torah observant. That's the biggest irony, is people who claim to be a part of a faith system who don't even have that faith. It's ironic. So, but when you come to this revelation, there are so many greater levels of understanding, a greater level of peace that passes all understanding. I mean, you just do away with all of this. You just spare the life of these animals, and none of this matters. None of these laws, these different stipulations for eating this flesh, you don't even have to worry about. And, I know there's a lot of people who say, well, I'm exempt because I purchased from a private sochet. I got a butcher who's Torah observant. And all right, I agree that it's a cleaner option. I'm not going to argue that. It's a healthier option. It's not filled with as many toxins and all the stuff that they accumulate over the process of factory farms. Okay. The antibiotics, the hormones, the sickness, a lot of that beef in the store, it's sick animals. So I'm not arguing that it might be a cleaner option to have your own butcher or even slaughtering your own animals, but it neglects the commands discussed throughout this section. The animals were only to be handled within a specific area and by a Levitical priest. So this brings us to a pivotal fork in the road. And this is in this video, this is where the rubber meets the road. Were the commands only temporary, or do they still apply today? Okay, and this is an argument that people in Torah say all the commands apply today. Well, and I agreed previously, based on the text, it does appear that certain sacrificial restrictions only applied during their journey through the wilderness until Yahweh enlarged their borders. At the same time, we saw even in the Talmud that understanding that the temple was meant for the centralized religion of the sacrifices and eating meat only. So even though some people interpret this enlarging their borders verse to justify why they can kill and eat anywhere, anytime, whatever they want, no restrictions, it was still widely known that no, the temple is the place only on certain occasion, only within those boundaries, and only by the priests where you should be eating meat. Okay, so I'm going somewhere with this. And I would imagine that a lot of pro-sacrifice people, meat eaters, Torah observant flesh eaters, would agree that the passage about enlarging their borders, I would imagine that if you're a flesh eater and you observe Torah, you love that verse because it allows you to eat anytime, anywhere, even though you're ignoring the part that it's about your lust, the soul lust of the flesh. It's according to your lust that you're doing all this. You'll ignore that, but you'll emphasize the part that says, oh, restrictions are lifted. Slaughter anytime, anywhere. So you want to focus on that part of it, and you think that settles the matter, but it doesn't. It just creates more complications for your belief that by admitting that the restriction to sacrifice on your property was only temporary, then you're forced to also admit that some commands given to Moses no longer apply. You've trapped yourself, because if every command is an eternal behavior of God practiced in eternity, if all the commands are always to be observed, then you're forced to admit that. Some commands don't apply anymore. They're obsolete. They've been abolished. You hate that. Torah observers hate that word abolished. But if you think the command for centralized sacrifice was okay in one event, but then now it's not, it no longer applies, you have to admit that some laws are abolished, okay? And this is a predicament. These laws are obsolete now. They're done away with. It's a predicament for people who contend that every law given to Moses is just as valid today as it was when it was initially given. And that's a whole thing about Torah Hebrews today, is that they say, Oh no, Jesus came to reiterate all of the laws. Well, did he or didn't he? Because if he did, then you need to abide by this law, these commands that tell you you can only slaughter where there's a priest, a temple, and certain times of the year. But you're not willing to do that. You just want to emphasize the passage that said restrictions are lifted, which is you're misusing that. If centralized worship or centralized sacrifice, if it was only temporary, then it is a clear demonstration of an immediate law that no longer applies, thus proving that not every law given to Moses is an eternal law of Yahweh. If that law was temporary, then you can't say that every law given to Moses was an eternal behavioral system. Okay, that's the point. That's the problem. People in Hebrew roots don't want to admit that some laws were temporary. They applied to immediate circumstances of the people. The whole sacrificial system. And it's ironic because a lot of Torah believers, they'll admit, well, some laws cannot be observed today as a matter of practicality purposes, and specifically any command that would require a temple or a priest. Some laws are contextually applicable. They are applicable to the letter only when there is a standing temple. And this is commonly understood, especially when you start talking about capital punishment and things like that. People will automatically jump and be like, well, there's no temple or priest, so we can't observe those laws about capital punishment. We don't have witnesses to execute people, to give them that punishment. Okay, so in one instance, you're using this no temple business to justify why you don't have to observe certain laws. But when it comes to the food, no, we don't need a temple or a priest. We can do it whenever we want. Well, if we can do things whenever we want without a temple or a priest, why can't we just execute people, use the capital punishment? Why don't you kill a person who cheated on his wife instead of just justifying why you can't because there's no temple or priest? If there's no temple or priest, and for one instance, don't use that argument or don't disregard that argument when it comes to your lust for animal flesh. That's the point. There's so many man-made laws and traditions today. People, and I'll get there, because I think what I'm about to say, I actually say in my notes. And there it is. Through this example, it becomes apparent that Torah observance today is more commonly exercised out of convenience, meaning that people let preference determine how they will observe certain commands. It's hypocritical. So if the absence of a temple or a priest is enough to justify why we no longer are required to do certain commands, then why is it acceptable to partake in activities that do require a Levitical priest, such as slaughtering animals for food? Okay? And it also neglects that even after their restrictions were supposedly lifted, there were further instructions that seem to contradict this idea of free-range killing. Remember the passage in Deuteronomy 15? Thou shalt eat it before Yahweh thy God, year by year, in the place which he shall choose. That command was given after this supposed restriction was lifted. After the restriction was supposedly lifted, okay? Okay. If you believe that every written law is equivalent to the eternal law of Yahweh, then by your own standards, you are obligated to consume flesh only within the designated area, which can't be done since there's no standing temple or priesthood. But if you admit that these commands were only temporary, then you're faced with the inconvenient reality that some laws were for the immediate circumstances of Israel and no longer apply. So which is it? Is every law of Moses an eternal principle and that still applies, or do some no longer apply? You can't have your cake and eat it too. All right. No, I'm not saying it's completely unlawful to eat flesh, but it depends on which law you've submitted to. According to Levitical law, if you've placed yourself under the Levitical system, then technically you could be allowed to eat flesh prescribed by that system. But again, only if you're following the strict set of instructions that were covered in this section, what I just went over. And if people are truly concerned about following the law properly, then flesh eaters would have already come together to build a centralized place of worship and assign a priest to perform their sacrifices. They would recognize that eating flesh was never intended to be a normal part of everyday life. They would only do it periodically, occasionally, but it poses another issue. Where are the Levites? Okay, since we are missing two major qualifiers for slaughtering animals. So flesh eating, it becomes a matter today of forcing our culture into the Torah to justify why we're allowed to live according to our carnal pleasures and our lust. That's what people are doing. There's no way around it. Flesh eaters are putting the culture into the Torah. But here's the good news. There is an original Torah, an everlasting agreement. The original Torah that was given in the garden, it supersedes the law of the scribes, and it reveals a higher standard by which to live, okay? So even though consuming flesh might be lawful under scribal law or the written code of Moses, what you guys go by, it is unlawful according to eternal law. So it demonstrates why it is so important that we know the difference, okay? And that's one of the things I've been trying to hammer out for the past year. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The original Torah was introduced to mankind in the Garden of Eden, while the law of Moses dealt with the circumstances of the Israelites who fled Egypt. So if what modern Hebrew roots contends is true, that we are obligated to keep every law of Moses, then not one individual who eats meat can be deemed compliant because they continually disregard several commands. They neglect the purpose for sacrificial law. So the majority of meat eaters today are guilty by association simply because of their participation in the modern commercial food industry, which is a completely different system apart from the law of Moses. This is the food sacrificed to idols. And you take that meat home and you are doing the burnt offerings yourself on your altar, your grill, but you're still a part of a different system. It's so ironic. I'm trying to wrap up here. This is a long video. I'm sorry they've been so long, but there's a lot that I've packed into chapter 6, the moral nature of Yahweh. So it's ironic that so many people in Torah refuse to go to the gas station or a local convenience store on Shabbat. Do you know people who don't do this? Mostly on the grounds that they would be contributing to the clerk's labor on the Sabbath, and they don't want to be guilty by association. So selectively, they can identify when their actions indirectly affect their observance of Shabbat. But when it comes to meat consumption, suddenly they have no problem with any indirect correlation of the law. You know what I mean? Am I making sense here? A lot of people that I know, they identify as Torah observant, but they have no problem purchasing meat from a local grocery store. And by doing so, they contribute to the inhumane treatment of animals that's in the law, to treat animals good, to let them rest on the Sabbath, not to harm them. Okay. And then the cross-contamination issue that occurs, it compromises the kosher quality of their preferred cut of meat. So if you're not familiar with the abuse of animals that occurs in modern meat production plants, again, I always refer people to Food Inc. Number one, that'll just open the door. And I mean, there are plenty more that I've listed in chapter 9 of my other book, Crushing Conceptualism. But so bringing this thing to a close, did it make sense what I was talking about? Guilty by association, like what you do on Sabbath. People turn Sabbath observance into this thing it doesn't have to be. Like, they won't pump gas because they'll say, well, I've contributed to the clerk's labor. The worker in the store labored on the Sabbath because of me. Well, I'm willing to bet that thousands of Torah observant people, even people who hold to this mentality, shop on Amazon, who delivers on Sunday. Now, I mean, you have to really plan ahead if this is your mentality, because Amazon delivers every day now, right? So if you're getting deliveries on Sunday, then you're breaking your own standard. You know what I mean? Everybody works Sundays now. I mean, it's common to work Sundays wherever you go. And I would be willing to bet that commodities or things, conveniences, services, different things in your house indirectly relate to people working on Sundays. Okay, if you really think about it and you really want to go by that standard, then you have to realize that you can't get around it. You just can't. Now, that person in the grocery store or the convenience store or the gas station was going to be there on Sunday despite whether you get gas or not. You do realize that, right? Anyway, so yeah, all right, we're wrapping up here. It's permissible to eat certain meats according to scribal law or Mosaic law if kept to the letter, okay? But we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking clean meats constitute kosher eating. So, in view of the modern factory farm industry, it would be a violation of Torah for anyone to consume the product of today's meat industry. So there's no way out. Not a private butcher, not by slaughtering the cow yourself, but by complete submission to the original Torah. This is the only behavioral system that ensures a guilt-free diet and lifestyle. And although Torah adherents contend that every letter of the law is still applicable today, the sobering reality is that we simply cannot achieve what the law of Moses permits. Okay? It just can't be done. Kind of like I was explaining with, your standards for Shabbat, But by taking animal flesh completely out of the equation, this is the only way to do it. Take animal flesh out of the equation. It prevents any possible violation of the law, whether directly or indirectly. Okay, that's all I got for today. Sorry the video drug on for over an hour and a quarter, but that's it. Share the video, like it, please. I'm trying to get these videos. I'm starting to get more subscribers, so that's a good thing. People are liking, commenting. I'm getting messages from people even saying that they enjoy my videos. That makes me feel really good. So I'm glad I'm reaching people. So there it is. I hope you guys have a good week. Actually, this will probably be Thursday morning by the time some of you see this. I'm going to upload it Wednesday night. So I'll talk to you next week.